Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials, European allies, and intelligence analysts had anticipated, feared, and prepared for. A proposal that unfolded not over weeks of careful diplomacy, but in a matter of hours. Hours that shocked European capitals. Hours that forced Zelensky's hand. Hours that revealed deep fault lines in the Western alliance that many had hoped would remain hidden. What President Trump did today crossed a line that America's closest allies had desperately hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Ukraine responded with clarity, defiance, and unmistakable resolve. Tonight, Maddow walks you through exactly what happened, why it matters, and what it tells us about the dangerous new phase this conflict has entered. What we witnessed today wasn't just a diplomatic disagreement. It was a collision between two fundamentally different visions of how this war should end. Caught in the middle is Ukraine, a nation that has spent 3 years fighting for its survival. And today made clear it will not accept terms dictated by anyone, not Moscow and not Washington. For weeks, there had been signals, unofficial, subtle, not formal statements that the Trump administration was preparing something unprecedented. Trump has been transactional, yes, but predictable in his transactionalism. His moves usually follow a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a pattern. But what set off alarm bells in Kyiv, Brussels, and London this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts tracking diplomatic back channels noticed the indicators, the sudden increase in communication between Washington and Moscow, unexplained delays in military aid shipments, the quiet recall of key diplomatic personnel, and the cancellation of scheduled calls between Zelenskyy and senior U.S. officials. Whenever the Trump administration goes quiet on Ukraine, it usually signals that something is about to get loud. European officials watched. They knew Trump had campaigned on ending the war quickly, admired Putin's strength, and viewed the conflict through a purely transactional lens, success measured not in principles defended, but in deals closed. But no one outside Trump's inner circle knew how far he was willing to go until today. Okay? Early this morning, State Department sources detected unusual diplomatic activity, including back-channel communications with Moscow that hadn't been activated in over Shabbat months. These are the channels American presidents only use when signaling a major policy shift, willingness to negotiate, or delivering an ultimatum. Analysts couldn't determine which of these applied, but they knew the administration was changing its posture toward Ukraine. By mid-morning, the contours of Trump's proposal leaked. Sources revealed a framework that stunned observers: an immediate ceasefire along current lines, Ukraine abandoning NATO membership aspirations for at least ours years, internationally supervised referendums in Russian-occupied territories, phased reduction of Western sanctions on Russia tied to compliance, and a significant reduction in U.S. military aid to Ukraine regardless of Russian agreement. This was not negotiation. It was a capitulation demand dressed as diplomacy, and it came from Washington, not Moscow. Ukraine's response was extraordinary. Within hours, President Zelenskyy convened an emergency session of the National Security Council. The Foreign Ministry issued a formal rejection, and Zelenskyy addressed the nation with a speech, leaving no room for ambiguity. These weren't routine statements. They were declarations of principle, signaling Ukraine's willingness to stand alone if necessary. That resolve sent shockwaves through capitals around the world. Tonight, Ukrainian officials confirmed that Zelenskyy's government has formally rejected every major element of Trump's proposal. On territorial questions, Ukraine's position is unchanged. Not 1 inch of sovereign territory will be traded. On NATO membership, Zelenskyy was blunt: Ukraine's security is not a bargaining chip for anyone, neither Moscow nor Washington.
On the proposed referendums, Ukraine's foreign minister called them a recipe for permanent instability, saying they would legitimize ethnic cleansing and forced deportation. On the reduction of military aid, Ukrainian officials made clear they would rather fight with less than surrender their future.
Let me read the key passage from Zelenskyy's statement tonight. "We have not sacrificed so much So many lives, so many cities, so many futures, to accept terms dictated by those who have never felt a Russian bomb fall on their homes. Ukraine will decide Ukraine's future, not Moscow, not any other capital, Ukraine. That is not the language of a nation preparing to negotiate. That is the language of a nation preparing to endure. It represents a fundamental break with the assumption held by many in Washington that Ukraine would ultimately accept whatever terms its patrons dictated. Today, Ukraine made clear that assumption was wrong. They didn't accept territorial concessions. They didn't accept NATO restrictions. They didn't accept the legitimization of Russian occupation. They rejected it all, fully aware of the costs. Intelligence analysts now believe Putin's recent demands, combined with heavy airstrikes over the past 24 hours, were designed to test the cohesion of Western support after Trump's election. Putin wanted to see whether Washington would pressure Kyiv to accept unfavorable terms. But the opposite happened. Ukraine did not capitulate under the combined pressure of Russian bombs and American proposals. Their rejection was so swift and unambiguous that even the Kremlin took notice. You don't get Moscow's attention easily, but today Kyiv did. Senior European diplomats, speaking under anonymity, described Putin's approach as coercive diplomacy, a tactic to force Ukraine into accepting terms before the battlefield could shift. Ukraine proved today that it remains both capable and willing to resist. Their rejection was immediate and coordinated, prompting European allies to issue supporting statements within hours. This coordination matters. It shows that Ukraine is not isolated. Zelenskyy is not simply reacting, he is leading. He is shaping the diplomatic landscape even as his country absorbs devastating attacks. That leadership, under pressure from both enemies and allies, is what makes this moment historically significant. Reports from tonight reveal the scale of the crisis. Militarily, Russian forces launched over Ebat-Ursur's missiles and drones at Ukrainian infrastructure overnight, with Ukrainian air defenses intercepting approximately 500 tirs of incoming projectiles. At least civilians were killed, including 3 children in Kharkiv, and critical energy infrastructure in 4 oblasts was damaged. Diplomatically, France reaffirmed Ukraine's right to determine its future. Germany called an emergency EU foreign ministers meeting. Poland pledged increased bilateral military support regardless of U.S. policy. The United Kingdom reaffirmed its commitment to Ukrainian security. This wasn't just Ukraine standing alone. This wasn't just a rejection of Trump's terms. This was a realignment, a signal that European commitment to Ukraine may now operate on a track partially independent of American policy. That separation is precisely what Putin has struggled to achieve since the war began. For every attempt to divide the Western alliance, Ukraine and its European partners have reinforced unity. Today was no exception. Putin thought Trump's return to power might hand him a victory he couldn't achieve on the battlefield. But tonight, the opposite is happening. Ukraine is more defiant than ever, Europe is more unified than expected, and even within the United States, Trump's proposal is facing pushback from members of his own party. Senator Lindsey Graham, hardly a critic of the president, called the proposal deeply concerning. Former National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster said it would embolden aggressors worldwide. A bipartisan group of senators reaffirmed congressional support for Ukraine, regardless of executive branch policy. This is not the reaction Putin expected. This is not the isolation he hoped for, and certainly not the capitulation he demanded. What makes this moment so dangerous and consequential is that Putin's latest move came at a time of enormous internal pressure. Hardliners in the Kremlin demand a decisive military victory. Oligarchs want sanctions relief and access to frozen assets. Military commanders want more troops and resources. Ordinary Russians, feeling the economic strain, want the war to end. Putin is balancing all these demands while managing battlefield setbacks that have eroded his credibility. When leaders in that position make sudden moves, they act from vulnerability, not strength. The massive airstrikes we've seen this week were not signs of confidence. They were signs of desperation, an attempt to force a resolution before the situation on the ground shifts further. And Trump's proposal, intentionally or not, played directly into that strategy, signaling to Putin that Washington might deliver what Russian missiles could not: Ukrainian capitulation. But today, Ukraine took that option off the table, potentially changing the trajectory of this war. The formal response from the State Department, now distributed to all U.S. embassies, was carefully worded but unmistakable. The U.S. supports a negotiated end, but any resolution must respect Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. That is diplomatic language for, we hear the criticism, and we're trying to walk this back. You rarely hear that kind of hedging from an administration immediately after a major policy announcement, unless something serious has gone wrong. Tonight, something serious has gone wrong for the White House. The proposal meant to demonstrate American leadership instead revealed American division. The offer meant to pressure Ukraine instead unified Ukraine's supporters. The diplomatic initiative meant to end the war instead clarified just how far apart the parties remain.
Meanwhile, President Zelenskyy addressed the Ukrainian people with somber determination. We did not start this war, we did not invite this suffering, but we will decide how it ends. No nation, no matter how powerful, has the right to trade away the territory of another nation. That is not diplomacy, that is imperialism with better marketing.
A third possibility, officials say, is that Russia seeks permanent divisions within the Western alliance, betting that a fractured coalition will eventually abandon Ukraine. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't equivocate, they didn't ask for more time. They didn't signal willingness to negotiate on Russia's terms. They rejected the proposal outright, proving that Russian strategy cannot count on Ukrainian exhaustion or Western betrayal. What we are witnessing is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see if Ukraine can be pressured into accepting permanent losses. Ukraine is showing its sovereignty is non-negotiable. European allies want to prevent the collapse of the security order built since World War II. And the United States, now divided between an administration seeking quick deals and a Congress committed to Ukrainian support, aims to prevent a catastrophic failure that would embolden adversaries worldwide. Intelligence officials are now monitoring Russian military movements with heightened attention. Forces are repositioning in ways that suggest preparation for offensive operations. Communication intercepts indicate Kremlin frustration with Ukraine's rejection. Analysts warn Putin's decision to escalate airstrikes is likely part of a broader coercion strategy intended to break Ukrainian morale before diplomatic options close. But Ukraine is not breaking. In fact, Ukraine is consolidating. Their response today, swift, coordinated, and unequivocal, sent a clear message to Moscow that pressure tactics will not produce capitulation. And it sent a message to Washington that alliance does not mean subservience. European officials described Ukraine's stance tonight as principled, necessary, and historic. That's diplomatic language for, we agree with Kyiv, even if we can't say it directly, and that quiet European alignment may prove more important than any single statement or proposal. As the night continues, more details are expected about what exactly Trump hoped to achieve with this initiative. Was it a genuine attempt at peacemaking, a pressure tactic designed to force Zelenskyy to the table? Or a miscalculation that underestimated Ukrainian resolve? We don't yet know. What we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It prevented the narrative from shifting toward inevitable compromise. It reinforced European commitment at a critical moment. It also reminded the world that Ukraine is not a passive object of great power politics. It is an actor in its own right. What happens next will depend on Moscow's decisions in the coming days. If Putin scales back attacks and returns to diplomacy, this moment may be remembered as a turning point toward negotiation. If he escalates further, Ukraine and its allies have already demonstrated they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are not intimidated. They have shown they are ready to endure. In this war, endurance has proven to be the most powerful weapon. And tonight, for the first time in weeks, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Russian state media, usually bombastic and confident, has been notably restrained in its coverage of today's events. The usual triumphalism is absent. The usual threats are muted. When Moscow is quiet, it means they are thinking. It means they are reassessing. It means they are carefully choosing their next move. And because tonight Putin learned something he should have learned long ago, Ukraine will not be bullied into submission. Pressure does not produce capitulation. It produces defiance. Nations fighting for their survival do not make decisions based on the convenience of others. And this story is far from over. Right? The coming days will bring new challenges, new pressures, and new tests of will. But tonight, one thing is clear: Ukraine remains unbowed. The Western alliance, though strained, has not broken. The dream of a quick, easy resolution that sacrifices Ukrainian sovereignty remains exactly what it always was: a fantasy. This is a war that will be decided by endurance, by courage, and by the willingness to defend principles even when it is costly. And tonight, Ukraine showed the world that it possesses all